and take a chance on getting it back, you gamble.
Right.
And don't do that. But my mother's health was very poor, and we didn't have all the fancies that you have to eat now because um, biscuits was a rarity. That was a Sunday morning dish, you might say, mostly. And we had what you call whole cake. If you know what that is,
yeah.
they wouldn't take time to make biscuits and just make it all in one cake and put it in the pan and bake it. But on
It ain't too bad
Sundays,
either, is it?
Sunday dinner, no, it's not. It's great. But on Sunday mornings, then they would have biscuits and whatnot. But my mother's health got bad, going back to the story we was talking about. And she taught us to not gamble, but there was a store belonging to a Ralph Caldwell. It was on the highway above home there. And this was about the time that slot machines would come to be a few of them through the community. My mother had taught us to leave that machine alone because it's gambling. But on this particular time, I had worked around and accumulated a few pennies. It was a penny machine. But I went to that machine on that day and I looked at it and I said, now, Mother said don't gamble. But if I could win some money, I could buy some groceries. And I said, no, I don't think Mama will whoop me if I buy groceries with the money. Well, I don't remember, probably 3 or 4 pennies, but I put one in. If I remember correctly, it gave me 9 pennies. And then I put in another, and I either got 9 or 15. In other words, I had about a quarter. And I looked at that and I said, now, I ought to quit now and buy a little something, so I'm going to try it one more time. And I put in another penny and I hit the jackpot. The 3 bars rolled up and I hit the jackpot. And the pennies just rattled and went all out on the floor, and I was picking up pennies. And the man looked at me and said, the jackpot hasn't been hit in a long time. But when I got it all counted up, I'm not able today to tell how much I had, but I had a handful of money. And I started buying groceries. You could get a little bag of flour then for just pennies. So I bought flour and I bought lard. And, they called it lard in those days. It was not shortening like it is today. It was lard. So I bought a pound of lard. I got some sugar and I just got the general groceries for the family. I spent it all for groceries. I didn't keep any because I spent it all for groceries. And I carried on back home. My mother was staying away from home trying to work to support the family, but she got sick and she come home on Thursday that particular week, and she said, I don't know what we're going to do. I was waiting to the last to tell her because my mother would whip you then for breaking rules, and I didn't know whether I was going to get a whipping or what not. But she said, well, I got sick and said I had to quit early this week and I'm short of money. Said, we'll take it and buy what groceries we can. That was a good time. I said, Mama said, I've already bought groceries. I said, well, where'd you get them at? And I was a little slow about telling her, but I told her that I did. I played the slot machine, but I bought it all in groceries. I'm not able to say what my mother said, but she just kind of turned away, and I think now I can know what it was all about. But she never did chide me for that one-time gambling. She never did say anything about it. But I got a great lesson from that. I'm not enticing anybody to gamble, not whatever. But they come needs in life that is different from going out there for the purpose of gambling to cheat somebody. This is one time this was done with the insight into it. If I'm lucky, I'll get groceries for the family. But not many people gamble for that purpose.
Oh, no. That's totally 180 degrees from what most people gamble for.
That's right.
They just want to win that money. They're not interested in putting food on the table or anything like that.
Right.
I tell you, that is something else. We was talking a minute ago about these old-timey midwives. Right. I'd like for you to come back and tell me a little bit about if you remember any of those in the community and their names.
Well, yes, I do. And can I just be frank? about this just a
Yes,
minute?
sir.
All right.
You
Well,
want me to shut it down, or you
no,
want-
just leave it. I
Just let
think
it
it's
run.
all right.
Be
'Cause
just as
we're not
frank as
going
you
into
want
anything
to.
that we was. But you know, when I was a little boy, I was almost into my teens before that I knew that babies didn't come out of stumps and old logs.
Is that?
No.
Well, you ain't
Is
quite-
is that?
That's unreal. A lot of people in this day and time don't understand that.
Maybe they'd be better off if they thought they did. But nevertheless,
Yeah.
you see, this is what I don't know. Some people says, well, people lied to children and things like that. But there were some things back when I come up that children were supposed to know some things about, and some things was a waiting time.
Right.
They had a waiting period, kind of like insurance policies today. They're not good for a certain amount of time, but they had a waiting period before you know some of these things. So in this particular thing, the midwife, when they would go through the community, they carried their bag or whatnot, and I had two aunts. Both of them was midwife. Aunt Corey Little was a midwife, and Aunt Mary Hayes was a midwife, and they would go to deliver the babies. And I know I can remember when my younger sisters were born, and at that particular time, then I didn't have no idea what was going on, but I knew my aunts, and then when they would come and go away, then I'd have a little sister, and I was the last boy, and so this put me to wondering sometimes, because I had to take care of these babies. My mother worked out in the field, and it was my job to take care of the babies. But however, these midwives, they were something there that there was a principle about them that after you grew up and understood their work and what it was all about, then you were able to appreciate them for the tasks that they undertook. With the today we have the delivery rooms and all that, but with the meager things that they had, we of today, of that age, can look back in life and thank God for somebody that had the nerve, somebody that had the time, somebody that had the concern for somebody else to take on this task in life to carry it out. This is brought out from Bible times. As you remember back there when one king notified all the midwives to destroy all the male children that were born. And this goes back to those days, the midwives that come on to carry on in the time of civilization to the extent that they had the knowledge of carrying on like this. And today, that's two aunts that I can take my hat off to, because many of the boys and girls of my age in the community, they can look back and they were brought into the knowledge that these midwives were the attendants at our birth.
What was their names?
Cora Little and Mary Hayes.
Did they live to be old, or did they?
Yes, they did. They lived to be old. They were very old.
Well, back at that time, and I can go back a pretty good ways myself, but back at that time, and especially up in that area, there were not that many doctors that you could get to real quickly, was there?
Well, I would think not. They talk about Dr. Miles and I can't remember the other doctor's name, but now they would travel by horse and buggy.
Yeah.
In those days, they would travel, and they came to the home, but his fee was very meager, but the what people had to live on was they couldn't afford a doctor.
They called him at the last resort.
Last
probably.
resort, the doctor. Yeah. That's right.
And a lot of times I've been told that people would either be better or dead time he got there.
Well, right.
Or going through the crisis. I'll put it that way.
Right. Going through the crisis.
Well, now I remember some people talking to me, and I can remember the old telephone lines. There were telephones back years and years ago, and then we went through a period of no telephone.
Right.
Did y'all have telephones back up in that country?
Well, there was one in my boyhood days that I can remember of. It was at a Parsons store there, and it hung on the wall, and then you would walk up to it, take your receiver down, and turn a crank on the side of the telephone, and then it would ring, and then you would you'd call up Central, and they would connect you with the line. And I'm not so familiar how it worked, but they did have a telephone that you could call them.
Now I'm gonna touch on something else here that you and I talked a little bit about the other day that I feel like needs to be recorded. Is back then you had no undertakers to speak of, did you?
No, no, not so.
We're talking of death now.
That's right.
Yeah.
In my early boyhood days, the undertaker, they was probably one, but he was just, you might say, for the more upper class people. The in back of my father, I remember back from the time my father lived up until he died, I didn't know of anyone at that particular time being carried to the undertakers of as such. When somebody died in the community, we had say 3 or 4 men, Mr. Remus Horton, Mr. Garfield Parsons, and Mr. Tilden Sainer. They were 3, and Mr. Sam Parsons, Mr. Garfield. They were the main men that took the place of what the undertaker is today. When somebody would die, they would call them in, they'd come in and wash the person and lay them on what they call cooling board. And this cooling board was made out sometime. They would just take 2 rough plank that they would have and wrap them in a sheet and lay them on chairs or whatnot and lay this person out there and get them set like they wanted to put them in the casket. They would fold their arms, and then they'd have problems, of getting the eyes to stay closed. I remember when they'd lay money on the eyes to hold the eyes together until the eyes closed. Sometimes the teeth would be showing, and they would tie a cloth around under their face to hold their mouth together until it was set.
Did the men do all of this for the men and women, or did you have women do?
No, they had women in the community, and the midwives played a great part in that.
Oh, okay.
They would come, the women would lay out the women, and the men would lay the men out. Then after they got them laid out and set, then the Turner White Casket Company come into being in my early boyhood days that I know about. That's the only place I know you could buy a casket. But before that time, I know that they would make the casket. They would lay the individual out, and they would go about making the casket. They would try to get boards wide enough to make the sides. Then this casket was somewhat form-fitting. It was sloped from the shoulders down to the feet, sloped this way, and then in the head it was sloped back in this way. This casket was kind of a frightful thing to look at. It's kind of hard to sleep at night after looking at this. Before undertakers were made available to all, sometime when they lay the person out, especially a long period of sickness, it was a frightful sight to look at. The whites of the eyes would be showing, their teeth would be showing. And then they were laying that casket, they covered it with black cloth, and the inside was white. And then this person laying in that black casket, lined with white cloth, and then this disposition about them, maybe you'd expect to see them like you saw them in everyday life, and then you see them in this condition. Then it would shake you up. As a child, I'm not talking about as a child, it would shake a child up to go home and see a person in that kind of condition. Then another thing, we have wakes today at the funeral home, and it lasts anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. But our wakes at that time would last all night long. In my early boyhood, it was wake all night, and they'd sing principally all night long. They would sing, and they would come crowds to the wake, and they would sing all over to way over 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. They would just sit there and sing. I remember this happening, and they would stay somebody up. At that particular time, everybody didn't go to bed when somebody died. Somebody stayed up all night long. Now we go to the funeral home and stay hour. Everybody go home and go to bed, but you didn't do it then. Somebody stayed up in the home all night long. And And in singing, they would sing the way over in the night. They would take a period. They would eat. And they would talk. And all this went on at the wake of the individual in the very early years of my life.
Did they have special songs, or were they more or less like the old gospel?
More or less like the old gospel. They would sing, more or less, it was what we call Christian harmony.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
This, I don't know how it was in other communities. This is just what happened in my community.
Right. Well, this is
where I
what
live.
we're actually, what happened in your
Right.
community.
This is where I lived. And the Christian harmony was a long book. It was about 12 inches long, and then when you opened it up, it made a 24-inch book. I say about a 10 by 24 when it was opened up. And these songs they come back, they were composed more or less, I would think, in the Deep South. And they were composed, most of the time you could go back to Bible times. That's the way they were composed. Now, this type of music was taught to the youth in my early youth when before I started the school. I was able to sing vocal music by looking at it. I sit on my oldest brother Marshall, I sit on his knee and learn the notes, how to sing the notes. This is do, re, mi, fa, sol. I learned how to do that sitting on my brother's knee. And these are some of the things that stays with you, because if you one time learn vocal music and the rudiments of music, then that's something that stays with you for a lifetime. When I see a song laid down today, if it's got shape music to it, then I might not be able to perform the music all the way, but you don't get too far away from it because I'm able to keep up by what I learned in my early youth.
Now, I'm going to let you bring me a little further up in your life, but when did you get married?
I got married December the 24th, 1937.
Who was your wife?
Novella Carlton Howell.
How old were you at that time?
I was 18 years old.
How old was she?
She's 17.
Tell me a little bit about starting out, if you don't mind now.
All right. This all started before I even thought about marrying Novella. Mr. Everett Hayes was teaching school at the old Thankful School that we talked about, and you know, school closes are different to what they is today. Everybody looked forward to school closing, and on that particular school closing day, we had a play there, and Novella was getting married to Picton Ripcord. He was a bandit, and she was going to marry Picton. I was the policeman at that time, and I had a 38 special swung on my side. I was kind of wobbling around the gun about half as long as I was, but I was wobbling around with a 38 on my side, and so I was going to arrest Picton Ripcord. So I was so small at that time in that particular play until the teacher shot the gun for me. He got behind the curtain and shot the gun for me and let me run out. He had a blank in it. Anyhow, I run out with the gun and arrested Picton Ripcord. They was going to get married. This was right at the marriage ceremony. They done got to the altar. Yeah. But I arrested him, and I looked at Novella, and she looked so sad till I wanted to have a husband. And I offered myself, and she accepted, and I married her.
In the play?
In the play. I married her in the play. No, we was little dreaming that this would become to be a reality, but, I remember several years after that, Novella and I were both brought up in church.
Yeah.
And I went to school with Novella, and I liked her position, the things about her. And so it struck me one Sunday in church that I'm going to ask Novella if I can go home with her. So we got outside, and I asked Novella if I could go home with her. And I don't remember the exact words she said, but she left me with the impression, you haven't been going home, and why you want to go to Dunn? And so we went on, we had to walk. She lived about, I say, at least 2 miles from the church. We had to walk, but I walked on, and I went almost home with her that time, but her father was a man that I was kind of shy about, you know. But after that, I picked up enough nerve to go all the way home with her. And her father done me so much good one day. He told me, he said, Lamont said, I appreciate you for one thing. This may not be his words, just what I got out of it. He said, you do come all the way to the house with my girl. And said I appreciate you being that much of a man. So I went on and I went with Novella quite a while. I don't know how many years, but we kind of corresponded along there together. And then one day we was walking across the bottom towards the house, and this question I've been wanting to ask for a long time, it come about. I was walking along behind her in the path. And I said, Novella, I said, will you marry me? And she just turned and stopped in the path and turned around and looked at me. And I don't know whether she said yes or no, but I kind of got the look in her eye that it was going to be all right.
Yeah. You go all the way home.
So from that, then it got to be, you know, back then I was working at a sawmill, and I wasn't making that much, but they had this cherry candy, you know. And I think that's one of the first gifts that I bought her. After she got the look that I went to the store and got a box of this cherry candy and carried it to her. So it went on from that until we finally got together and set the date to get married. And when we set the date to get married, then that was in 1937. And, you know, the 36 Fords had just come out with the trunk on the back, and this one was blue, and there was a white man owned this car. Just few black people owned cars in our community at that particular time. So my cousin and her boyfriend and Novella and I, we set the date to be married the same day. So we went down to the courthouse to get married, and there wasn't a preacher there, but Mrs. Audrey Turpleton, I have all that down on record. The 12th and 24th, 1937, we went to the courthouse to get married. Larry Willis and Homer Brookser was our witnesses for getting married. We were in that little small room there to get married. So our friends, they had a little problem. I went and got all my papers signed the day ahead, but they went to get married, so then he had to go and get his papers signed for her to get married. So by the time they got their papers signed and ready to get back, then we had to help them some about getting their papers signed. See, we already got married, and we had ours fixed up. We all got married, and all four of us rode in the back of that little narrow 36 Ford, and we had plenty of room. But you know, through prosperity and steak and chicken and all that, those two ladies and that man, I never did gain, but that man, he got to be some size. And the ladies, they improved in size, and I'd hate then to this day to try to all four of us get in the back of that little car. However, it was a great experience. I enjoyed it, and did you get
to move out right after you got married, or?
About 2 weeks after I got married, I was able to move out. And that was quite an experience because, you know, at that time, you've heard talk of mule drivers. And
right.
I was a pretty good mule driver. So I went and got Uncle Robert Carter's mule and wagon. And there was a camp, sawmill camp, back in the mountain. You know, it was several miles back in the mountain, but they had a good wagon road in there. So I got Novella, and, you know, we just had a board across the wagon bed, and I sat down. I was the mule driver, and so she sat down beside of me. And I was just as happy as I'd be today in a Cadillac. But, you know, we got the mule. Didn't own no mule, but we borrowed one. Yeah. We went on back in the mountain, and they had a little stove there that just set up on the legs, you know, no warming oven to it. Well, that was a cook in this little stove. Or maybe it was my wife's cooking. Let me say it that way. I thought she baked some of the best bread on that little stove that I ever eat. So we brought the little stove back and went on, and my mother had gave us a bed and some quilts and whatnot. So we moved out, and we lived out 3 or 4 miles from my mother. We could walk, and so when we moved out there, we was just alone by ourselves. But they was an elderly couple lived next to us. They had some young people that was a little younger than we was, but we enjoyed living out there. We almost, I say, adopted them as, they adopted us as their children, and we counted them as almost as father and mother. It was Mr. Artaway Satterwhite and his wife. And they would counsel us along as to how to get along as husband and wife. I went ahead and then over a year's time, then we were blessed with our first child. And we named him Norman. And then Alfred came along. We had 2 boys then. Then Jones Alton came along, and that made us 3 boys. And we was getting along pretty good with the 3 boys, and then Samuel come along. It made us 4 boys. And then after Samuel come along, we had 4 boys, and we thought we was doing pretty good. And then it come time, then we was blessed to get away from midwives. We was going to the hospital. So I went to the hospital on that particular time of childbearing, and the doctor went in the room, and I thought he stayed longer than he ought to. I was prancing up and down the hall and wondering. So he come out and he said, well, Hal, I got news for you. And I said, sure, it's a girl this time. He said, you got 2 boys this time. I said, what? You got 2 boys this time, twins. So we named them Ronald and Roland. And so that made us 7 boys. Still little girls. And it went ahead then and we said, well, you know, there's a lot of things you like to try the 2nd and 3rd time, but when it comes to the 8th time, you begin to wonder. But we tried the 8th time, and here come another boy. Well, just almost ready to give up. But however, the 9th time it proved